My name is Detective Anthony. Martinez and I have been working with the Denver Police Department for 19 years now, and in all those years I have investigated hundreds of cases. But there is one story that changed me forever, and it is the story of Henry Collins and his daughter Lily. And when I tell you this story, I want you to understand that sometimes good people do bad things for the right reasons, and sometimes the system fails us so completely that we are left with impossible choices. I met Henry Collins on a cold February morning in 2018 when they brought him into the station in handcuffs, and he was 48 years old with graying hair and tired eyes and calloused hands from years of manual labor. And when I sat down across from him in the interrogation room, he looked at me and said, "Detective, I know I broke the law and I am ready to accept the consequences, but I need you to understand why I did what I did, and I need you to know that I would do it all again." So I listened, and over the next several hours, Henry Collins told me his story, and I took notes and I asked questions. And by the end of it, I had tears in my eyes, because this was not just a criminal confession, this was a father's love letter to his daughter, and now I am going to share that story with you, based on everything Henry told me that day. Henry Collins was born in Denver, Colorado in 1970. And he grew up in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and people looked out for each other. And his father had been a construction worker and his mother had been a seamstress, and they taught Henry the value of hard work and honesty and family. And Henry had always been good with his hands, and after high school he became a plumber and started his own small business. When Henry was 25, he met a woman named Rachel at a church social, and she was beautiful with blonde hair and blue eyes and the kindest smile he had ever seen, and they fell in love quickly and got married within a year. And 2 years later, their daughter Lily was born, and Henry told me that the day Lily was born was the happiest day of his life, and he held that tiny baby in his arms and promised her that he would always protect her and always keep her safe. Lily was a perfect baby, and she grew into a wonderful little girl, and she had her mother's blonde hair and blue eyes, and she had the sunniest disposition, and everyone who met Lily loved her immediately, and she was curious about everything, and she loved to draw and paint and create things. And by the time she was 5 years old, her kindergarten teacher was telling Henry and Rachel that Lily had real artistic talent. Henry worked hard to provide for his family, and he would wake up at 5 in the morning and work all day fixing pipes and unclogging drains and installing water heaters, and the work was dirty and difficult. But Henry never complained, because he was doing it for his wife and daughter, and every night he would come home tired and sore. But the moment he saw Lily running to greet him at the door, all his exhaustion would disappear. Rachel was a stay-at-home mom, and she devoted herself completely to raising Lily, and she volunteered at Lily's school. And she took Lily to art classes and music lessons, and she made sure Lily knew she was loved and cherished, and the three of them were happy. And they did not have much money, but they had each other, and that was enough. But when Lily was 4 years old, tragedy struck, and Rachel started having chest pains, and they took her to the hospital, and the doctors discovered that she had a congenital heart defect that they had never known about, and they tried to treat it, but her heart was too damaged, and Rachel died 3 weeks later, and she was only 31 years old. Henry was devastated, and he could not understand how someone so young and so full of life could be taken away so suddenly, and he had to explain to 4-year-old Lily that Mommy was not coming home, and Lily did not understand, and she kept asking when Mommy would be back, and it broke Henry's heart into a million pieces. After Rachel died, Henry had to figure out how to be both mother and father to Lily, and he cut back on his work hours so he could take Lily to school and pick her up, and he learned how to braid her hair and pack her lunches and help her with homework, and it was hard, and there were days when Henry felt completely overwhelmed. But he never let Lily see him struggle, because he had made a promise to Rachel on her deathbed, and Rachel had held his hand and whispered, "Henry, please take care of our baby girl and make sure she knows how much I love her." So Henry devoted himself completely to Lily, and they became incredibly close, and Lily would tell everyone that her daddy was her hero and her best friend, and Henry would take Lily to the park on weekends, and they would fly kites and have picnics, and Lily would draw pictures, and Henry would save every single one, and put them on the refrigerator. As Lily grew older, her artistic talent became even more apparent, and by the time she was 10 years old, she was creating paintings that were remarkably mature and sophisticated. And her art teacher told Henry that Lily could have a real future as an artist if she continued to develop her skills. And Henry encouraged Lily's passion, and he bought her art supplies even though money was tight, and he would sit with her while she painted and tell her how proud he was. Lily loved to paint pictures of her mother even, though she barely remembered her, and she would ask Henry to tell her stories about Rachel, and Henry would describe how kind and loving Rachel had been and how much she had adored Lily, and Lily would cry sometimes and say, "Daddy, I wish I could remember Mama better," and Henry would hug her and say, "Mama is always with us in our hearts, and she is watching over you, and she is so proud of the beautiful person you are becoming." When Lily turned 12, everything changed, and it started with a fever that would not go away, and Henry took Lily to the doctor thinking it was just the flu, but the fever persisted for over a week, and Lily started feeling exhausted all the time, and she had no energy, and she stopped wanting to paint, and Henry knew something was seriously wrong. The doctor ran some tests and told Henry to take Lily to the hospital for more comprehensive blood work, and Henry could hear the concern in the doctor's voice, and he felt a knot of fear forming in his stomach. And at the hospital, they did more tests, and Henry sat in the waiting room, holding Lily's hand and praying that everything would be okay. 2 days later, they got the results, and Henry sat in the oncologist's office while the doctor explained that Lily had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and it was a cancer of the blood and bone marrow, and Henry felt like the floor had dropped out from under him, and he could barely hear what the doctor was saying because his mind was screaming, "No, not my baby girl, not Lily." And the doctor was talking about treatment options and survival rates, but all Henry could think about was that he was going to lose his daughter just like he had lost his wife. The doctor explained that Lily would need immediate chemotherapy and that her best chance for long-term survival was a bone marrow transplant, and Henry asked what the success rate was. And the doctor said that with a successful transplant, Lily had about a 70% chance of full recovery, but without the transplant, she would likely not survive more than 6 months. Henry asked what needed to be done, and the doctor explained that first they needed to find a bone marrow match, and Henry immediately volunteered to be tested, but he was not a match, and they searched the bone marrow registry but could not find a suitable donor, and the doctor said they would keep looking, but in the meantime, Lily needed to start chemotherapy right away. Lily started chemo the following week, and it was brutal, and she would throw up constantly, and she lost her beautiful blonde hair, and she became weak and frail, and Henry would sit by her hospital bed and hold her hand and try to be strong for her, but inside, he was dying because watching his little girl suffer was the most painful thing he had ever experienced. After 3 months of chemotherapy, the doctors said they had found a potential bone marrow donor, and Henry felt a surge of hope, and the doctor explained that the transplant procedure would be complex and expensive, but it was Lily's best chance. And Henry said, "I do not care about the cost, just tell me what needs to be done and save my daughter." That was when the doctor told him that the total cost of the bone marrow transplant and the associated treatments would be approximately $400,000, and Henry felt his heart sink, and he said, "But I have health insurance through my business." And the doctor said, "Yes, but your insurance company has reviewed the case, and they have denied coverage." Henry could not believe what he was hearing, and he said, "What do you mean denied coverage? And my daughter is dying?" And the doctor explained that the insurance company, Vital Care Insurance, had classified the bone marrow transplant as an experimental procedure, and according to their policy, experimental procedures were not covered. Henry left the hospital in a daze, and he went home and he called the insurance company, and he spent hours on the phone being transferred from one department to another, and everyone he spoke to was polite but firm, and they all said the same thing, and the procedure had been classified as experimental, and therefore it was not covered under his policy, and Henry argued and pleaded and explained that his daughter would die without this treatment, but they would not budge. Henry hired a lawyer, and the lawyer reviewed his insurance policy and said, "Mr. Collins, I am sorry, but the policy does contain language that allows them to deny coverage for experimental procedures, and we could fight this in court, but that would take years, and your daughter does not have years, and Henry felt completely helpless. He started a GoFundMe campaign, and he reached out to everyone he knew asking for help, and friends and neighbors and even strangers donated what they could, and the local news ran a story about Lily's situation and more. Donations came in, but after 2 months, Henry had only raised $50,000, and he was still $350,000 short. Henry sold everything. He owned and he sold his truck and his tools and his furniture, and he took out a second mortgage on his house, and he borrowed money from every person he knew, and still, it was not enough, and time was running out, and Lily's condition was getting worse, and the doctors said that if they did not do the transplant within the next few weeks, it would be too late. Henry went to the Vital Care Insurance headquarters in downtown Denver, and he asked to speak with someone in charge, and they made him wait for 3 hours, and finally a vice president came out and listened to Henry's plea, and Henry showed him pictures of Lily and medical reports, and he begged them to reconsider. And the vice president said, "Mr. Collins, I sympathize with your situation, but our hands are tied by company policy. And if we make an exception for you, we would have to make exceptions for everyone." Henry said, "Then make exceptions for everyone and stop letting people die because of policy." And the vice president said, "I am sorry, Mr. Collins, but I cannot help you." And he walked away, and Henry sat in that lobby and cried, and a security guard eventually asked him to leave. Henry researched Vital Care Insurance, and he learned that the company was hugely profitable and that they had a reputation for denying claims, and that the CEO, Thelma Richardson, made $12 million per year in salary alone, and Henry found out that Thelma had personally implemented policies that made it easier to classify treatments as experimental, so the company could deny coverage and save money. Henry wrote letters to Thelma Richardson begging her to help, and he sent emails. And he even showed up at the company headquarters, asking to speak with her, but he was always turned away, and finally he received a form letter from her office, expressing sympathy but reiterating that company policy prevented them from covering experimental procedures. Meanwhile, Lily was getting sicker, and the chemotherapy was no longer holding the cancer at bay, and she was in the hospital full-time now, and Henry would sit by her bed every day, and Lily would look at him with those big blue eyes and say, "Daddy, I'm going to die," and Henry would fight back tears and say, "No, baby, you are going to be fine, and Daddy is going to take care of everything." But Henry knew he was running out of options, and he had exhausted every legal avenue, and he had begged and borrowed and fundraised, and still he did not have enough money, and the doctors told him that Lily had maybe 2 months left, and that if the transplant did not happen soon, it would be too late, even if they found the money. One night, Henry sat alone in Lily's hospital room while she slept, and he looked at her pale, thin face, and he thought about Rachel and about the promise he had made to her, and he thought about all the moments he had shared with Lily and all the moments they would never have if she died, and he realized that he was out of legal options, but he was not out of options entirely. Henry had always been a law-abiding citizen, and he had never even gotten a speeding ticket, and the idea of breaking the law was completely foreign to him. But as he sat there, watching his daughter dying, he realized that he would do anything to save her, and if that meant breaking the law, then so be it, because what good was being a good citizen if it meant watching his child die when there was something he could do to prevent it? Henry started researching Vital Care Insurance, and specifically Thelma Richardson, and he learned everything he could about the company's finances and about Thelma's personal wealth, and he discovered that she had offshore bank accounts and that she was involved in various tax avoidance schemes, and he realized that this woman who was letting his daughter die because of policy was herself a criminal who was stealing from the system. Henry did not know anything about computers or hacking, but he was determined to learn, and he spent every moment that he was not at the hospital teaching himself about cybersecurity and computer systems, and he watched online tutorials and read books and practiced on legal hacking platforms, and after 3 weeks he had developed a basic understanding of how to access computer systems. Henry knew he needed help, and he reached out on dark web forums looking for someone with advanced hacking skills, and he was careful and used encrypted communications, and eventually he connected with someone who went by the username Dark Angel, and Henry explained his situation and sent proof of Lily's condition, and Dark Angel wrote back, I had a daughter who died of cancer, and I would have done anything to save her, and I will help you. Together, Henry and Dark Angel spent 2 weeks planning, and they identified weaknesses in Vital Care's computer security, and they mapped out Thelma Richardson's personal financial accounts. And they created a plan to access the accounts and transfer money, and also to gather evidence of Thelma's tax fraud and other illegal activities. Henry knew that what he was about to do was wrong and that he would likely get caught and go to prison, but he also knew that if he did nothing, Lily would die, and he decided that he would rather spend the rest of his life in prison, knowing that Lily was alive, than spend the rest of his life free, knowing that he had let her die when he could have saved her. The night before they executed the plan, Henry sat with Lily, and she was very weak now and could barely stay awake, and she held his hand and said, Daddy, I am scared, and Henry kissed her forehead and said, I know, baby, but everything is going to be okay, and I promise you are going to get better. And Lily said, I love you, Daddy, and you are the best father in the whole world. And Henry had to leave the room because he did not want Lily to see him crying. Henry went home, and he sat at his computer, and he connected with Dark Angel. And they began the hack, and it took 6 hours, but they successfully penetrated Vital Care's financial systems and accessed Thelma Richardson's personal offshore accounts, and Henry transferred exactly $400,000 from Thelma's account to the hospital's account with instructions that it be applied to Lily Collins's treatment. At the same time, Dark Angel downloaded all of Thelma's financial records showing years of tax, fraud, and money laundering and illegal kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies, and they sent all of this evidence anonymously to the FBI and the IRS and to several investigative journalists. The next morning, Henry called the hospital and authorized them to proceed with Lily's bone marrow transplant, and the hospital confirmed that payment had been received. And they scheduled the procedure for 3 days later. Henry spent those 3 days with Lily, and he told her stories about her mother, and he held her hand, and he prayed that the transplant would be successful. And on the day of the transplant, Henry kissed Lily before they took her into surgery, and he said, I love you so much, baby. And Lily smiled weakly and said, I love you too, Daddy, and then they wheeled her away. The transplant surgery took 8 hours, and Henry paced the waiting room the entire time, and when the doctor finally came out and said the surgery was successful and Lily was in recovery, Henry collapsed in relief and thanked God over and over. But Henry's relief was short-lived, because 2 days later, the police came to the hospital, and they found Henry sitting by Lily's bed, and they said, Henry Collins, you are under arrest for wire fraud and computer fraud and unauthorized access to protected computer systems. And they put him in handcuffs. Lily was barely conscious, but she saw the handcuffs, and she said, Daddy, what is happening, and where are they taking you? And Henry tried to smile, and he said, do not worry, baby. Daddy just has to take care of some business, but you focus on getting better, and I will see you soon. And Lily started crying and saying, Daddy, please do not leave me. And it took everything Henry had not to break down. As the police led Henry out of the hospital, he looked back one last time and saw Lily reaching out for him and crying and calling for him. And it was the hardest moment of his entire life, but he told himself that it was worth it because Lily was going to live, and that was all that mattered. They brought Henry to the Denver Police Department, and that is where I met him. And when I walked into the interrogation room, he was sitting there quietly with his head down, and I introduced myself, and I told him that he was being charged with multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud and computer fraud, and that he was looking at potentially 20 years in prison. And Henry just nodded and said, I understand, detective. And I asked Henry if he wanted a lawyer, and he said yes, eventually. But first I want to tell you my story because I want someone to understand why I did what I did. And I want you to know that I am not a criminal, and I am just a father who loves his daughter. And so I sat down and I listened, and Henry told me everything. When Henry finished talking, I sat there for a long moment, and I did not know what to say because, on one hand, Henry had clearly broken multiple laws and had committed serious federal crimes. But on the other hand, I understood exactly why he had done it, and if I had been in his position, I honestly did not know if I would have made a different choice. I asked Henry if he had any regrets, and he looked at me and said, "Detective, my only regret is that I did not do this sooner, and my daughter suffered for months while I tried to work within the system, and the system failed her, and now at least she has a chance to live, and whatever happens to me is worth it." The investigation moved quickly, and the FBI took over the case because it involved wire fraud and computer crimes across state lines, and they traced the hack back to Henry, and they also identified Dark Angel, who turned out to be a former computer security expert named Robert Chen, who lived in Seattle, and Robert was also arrested and charged. The media got hold of the story, and it became national news, and the headlines were, "Father hacks insurance company to save dying daughter and desperate. Dad commits cybercrime for cancer treatment," and public opinion was sharply divided. And some people said Henry was a criminal who needed to be punished, regardless of his motivations. And other people said Henry was a hero who had exposed a corrupt system and had saved his daughter's life. Meanwhile, Lily's transplant was successful, and she began to recover. And after 3 weeks in the hospital, she was strong enough to go home, and she asked constantly about her father, and the doctors and nurses did not know what to tell her. And finally, Henry's sister Patricia moved in to take care of Lily, and Patricia had to explain to Lily that Daddy was in jail, but that he loved her very much, and that everything he did was for her. Lily was devastated, and she cried for days, and she did not understand why her daddy was in jail when he had saved her life, and she drew pictures of her and her father together, and she would hug the pictures and cry, and Patricia would hold her and try to comfort her, but there was no comforting a 12-year-old girl who had just lost her father after almost losing her own life. The evidence against Henry was overwhelming, and his public defender told him that if he went to trial, he would definitely be convicted and would likely receive the maximum sentence of 20 years. But if he agreed to a plea deal and pled guilty to the charges the prosecutor was willing to recommend, a sentence of 10 years with possibility of parole after 7, Henry did not care about himself, and all he cared about was Lily, and he asked if he could see her before he made any decisions, and the court granted him one supervised visit. And when they brought Henry to the visiting room in handcuffs and leg shackles, Lily ran to him and threw her arms around him and sobbed, "Daddy, I missed you so much," and Henry held her as best he could with his hands cuffed, and he said, "I missed you too, baby, and I am so glad you are getting better." Lily looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and she said, "Daddy, why are you in jail? And you did not do anything wrong, and you saved my life." And Henry said, "Baby, sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard choices, and I made a choice that broke the law, but I made it because I love you more than anything in the world." And Lily said, "But it is not fair." And Henry said, "I know, baby, but life is not always fair, and what matters is that you are alive, and you are going to grow up and have a beautiful life." Lily said, "Daddy, I do not want a beautiful life without you, and please come home." And Henry felt his heart breaking, and he said, "Baby, I cannot come home right now, but I want you to promise me something." And Lily said, "What?" Daddy and Henry said, "Promise me you will keep painting and keep creating beautiful art, and promise me you will be happy and live a full life and do all the things your mama and I dreamed you would do." And Lily nodded through her tears and said, "I promise, Daddy." The visit ended, and as they took Henry away, Lily screamed, "Daddy, please do not leave me, and I need you." And Henry looked back at her and tried to memorize her face because he did not know when he would see her again. Henry accepted the plea deal and pled guilty to all charges, and the sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months. Later, and during those 2 months, Lily continued to recover, and her cancer went into remission, and the doctors said she was doing remarkably well and that the transplant appeared to have been successful. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was packed with reporters and supporters and protesters, and the judge was a woman named Judge Patricia Morales, who had a reputation for being tough but fair, and before she pronounced sentence, she allowed several people to speak. Lily's doctor testified about her condition and about how the bone marrow transplant had saved her life, and about how without the procedure, Lily would have died within weeks. And the doctor said, "Your Honor, I do not condone what Mr. Collins did, but I understand why he did it, and I have seen too many patients die because insurance companies deny necessary treatments, Several of Henry's friends and neighbors spoke about what a good man he was and about how devoted he had been to Lily and about how he had worked 2 jobs after his wife died just to make sure Lily had everything she needed. And they all said that Henry was not a criminal but rather a desperate father who had been failed by the system. Then Patricia brought Lily to the stand, and Lily was still thin and pale, but she was alive, and she looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, my daddy is my hero, and he saved my life, and I know he broke the law. But he only did it because the insurance company would not help me, and they were going to let me die. And my daddy could not let that happen, and please, do not take my daddy away from me, because I already lost my mama, and I cannot lose my daddy too." By the time Lily finished speaking, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom, and even the prosecutor looked uncomfortable, and Judge Morales had to take a moment to compose herself. Then the prosecutor stood up and she said, "Your Honor, the government recognizes that this is a difficult case and that Mr. Collins was motivated by love for his daughter, but we cannot allow people to take the law into their own hands. No matter how sympathetic their circumstances, and Mr. Collins committed serious federal crimes, and if we do not punish him adequately, it sends a message that cybercrime is acceptable if you have a good enough reason, and therefore we ask that the court sentence Mr. Collins to the agreed-upon 10 years in federal prison." Henry's lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, my client has already paid a terrible price for his actions, and he has lost his freedom, and he has been separated from his daughter during a critical time in her recovery. And he faces years in prison away from the only family he has left in Henry. Collins is not a danger to society, and he is not a career criminal, and he is a loving father who made an impossible choice when faced with his daughter's imminent death, and we ask the court to consider a sentence of probation or house arrest so that Henry can be there for his daughter as she continues to recover." Finally, Judge Morales asked Henry if he wanted to say anything before she pronounced sentence. And Henry stood up and he looked at the judge and he said, "Your Honor, I know I broke the law, and I am not asking for mercy or forgiveness, and I am simply asking you to understand that I was faced with an impossible choice, and I could watch my daughter die while I followed the rules, or I could break the rules and give her a chance to live, and I chose my daughter. And I will always choose my daughter, and if I could go back and do it again, I would make the same choice, because my daughter is alive. And that is all that matters to me, and whatever punishment you give me, I will accept, because it is worth it to know that Lily will grow up and have a life." Judge Morales was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Mr. Collins, I have been a judge for 22 years, and this is one of the most difficult cases I have ever presided over, because the law is clear, and you committed serious crimes, and you hacked into computer systems, and you stole money, and you violated federal statutes, and under normal circumstances, you would receive a significant prison sentence." But the judge continued, and she said, "These are not normal circumstances, and your daughter was dying, and the insurance company that was supposed to help her refused to do so because of policy, and you exhausted every legal option available to you, and you begged and pleaded and fundraised, and still the system failed you, and so you took matters into your own hands, and what you did was wrong, but I understand why you did it." Judge Morales said, "I have also taken into consideration the fact that the money you stole went directly to paying for your daughter's medical treatment, and you did not profit personally from your crime, and in fact, you have lost everything, and I have also considered the fact that your hack exposed significant criminal activity by Thelma Richardson and Vital Care Insurance, and your actions led to a federal investigation that has resulted in multiple indictments." The judge looked at Henry and said, "Mr. Collins, I am going to sentence you to 10 years in federal prison, but I am suspending 7 years of that sentence, and you will serve 3 years in prison followed by 7 years of supervised probation, and during your probation you will be required to perform community service and speak to groups about healthcare reform and insurance company practices, and I am also ordering Vital Care Insurance to reimburse the full cost of Lily's treatment, which means the $400,000 you took will be returned to Thelma Richardson's accounts." Henry felt relief wash over him because 3 years was much less than he had expected, and it meant he would be there for Lily while she was still young, and the Judge, said Mr. Collins, I want to be clear that I am not condoning what you did, but I am taking into account the extraordinary circumstances, and I hope you will use your time in prison to reflect on your actions and to find legal ways to advocate for health care reform so that other families do not face the impossible choices you faced. As they led Henry out of the courtroom, Lily ran to him and hugged him and said, Daddy, 3 years and I can wait. 3 years and I will visit you every week and I will write you letters every day. And Henry held her tight and said, I love you so much, baby, and you be strong and keep painting and make me proud. Henry served his 3 years at a minimum security federal prison in Colorado, and Lily visited him every single week without fail, and she would bring her artwork to show him and tell him about school and about her recovery. And Henry lived for those visits, and he would save every drawing and every letter and hang them in his cell. While in prison, Henry became something of a celebrity among the other inmates, and many of them had families and children, and they understood what he had done and why. And Henry started teaching other inmates about their rights regarding health care and insurance, and he helped several of them file appeals for denied insurance claims for their families. Henry also began working with healthcare advocacy groups, and he wrote articles and gave interviews from prison about the failures of the American healthcare system and about how insurance companies prioritize profits over human lives. And his story resonated with millions of Americans who had their own horror stories about insurance denials. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation into Thelma Richardson and Vital Care Insurance uncovered massive fraud and corruption, and it turned out that Thelma had been systematically denying legitimate claims to boost the company's profits, and she had received bonuses based on how much money the company saved by denying claims, and federal prosecutors charged her with fraud and racketeering and tax evasion. Thelma Richardson went on trial, and the evidence against her was overwhelming, and dozens of families testified about how Vital Care had denied coverage for necessary treatments, and several people testified that their loved ones had died because Vital Care refused to pay for potentially life-saving procedures, and the jury found Thelma guilty on all counts, and she was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $40 million in restitution. Vital Care Insurance went bankrupt and was dissolved, and several other executives were also charged and convicted, and the scandal led to congressional hearings and eventually to reforms in how insurance companies could classify treatments as experimental, and hundreds of families who had been denied coverage received compensation. Henry was released from prison after serving his full 3 years, and on the day he walked out, Lily was waiting for him. And she was 15 years old now, and she was healthy and cancer-free, and her hair had grown back long and blonde, and she ran to her father and threw her arms around him and said, Daddy, welcome home. And Henry held her and cried and said, I missed you so much, baby. Lily had continued her art throughout Henry's incarceration, and she had won several awards and had been accepted to a prestigious art school with a full scholarship. And she told Henry, Daddy, I did what you asked, and I kept painting, and I never gave up. And Henry said, I am so proud of you, and your mama would be so proud too. Henry had to complete 7 years of probation, and as part of his probation, he traveled around the country, speaking at schools and community centers and healthcare conferences about his experience and about the need for healthcare reform, and he became an advocate for families dealing with insurance denials, and he helped create a non-profit organization that provides legal assistance to families fighting insurance companies. I stayed in touch with Henry over the years, and I visited him several times, and I watched as he rebuilt his life and worked to help others, and I saw how Lily thrived and grew into a beautiful and talented young woman, and she never forgot what her father had sacrificed for her. Lily is now 21 years old, and she graduated from art school last year, and she is working as a professional artist, and she creates paintings that raise awareness about childhood cancer and healthcare inequality, and she donates a portion of her earnings to families who cannot afford medical treatment. And she says that her father taught her that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when the system tells you it is wrong. Henry is now 54 years old, and he completed his probation last year, and he has rebuilt his plumbing business, and he continues to advocate for healthcare reform. and he has testified before Congress about insurance, company practices, and he has helped pass legislation in several states that limits how insurance companies can deny coverage. I asked Henry once if he regretted what he did, and he said, "Detective, I regret that I had to break the law, and I regret the stress it caused Lily, and I regret losing 3 years of her life, but I do not regret saving her, and if I had to do it all over again, I would make the same choice, because my daughter is alive and healthy and happy, and that is all that matters." This case taught me something important about justice and about the difference between law and morality, and what Henry did was illegal, but was it immoral? And he stole money, but he used it to save his daughter's life, and he hacked computer systems, but he exposed massive fraud and corruption, and he broke the rules, but the rules were broken to begin with. I think about Lily and about how close she came to dying, because an insurance company cared more about profits than about human life, and I think about Henry and about the impossible choice he faced, and I wonder what I would have done in his position, and I honestly do not know. What I do know is that our healthcare system is broken when a father has to become a criminal to save his daughter's life, and when insurance companies can legally deny life-saving treatments because of policy, and when families have to choose between bankruptcy and watching their loved ones die. Henry Collins broke the law, but he also saved his daughter and exposed corruption and sparked a national conversation about healthcare reform, and he paid for his crimes with 3 years of his freedom. And the question I leave you with is, this was justice served? And I do not have a simple answer. Today, Henry and Lily live in a small house in Denver, and they have dinner together every Sunday, and Lily shows Henry her latest artwork. And they talk about Rachel and about how proud she would be, and Henry still keeps every drawing Lily has ever made, and Lily still tells everyone that her father is her hero. I think about this case often, and I think about the thin line between right and wrong, and about how sometimes good people do bad things for good reasons, and about how the system fails us and forces us to make impossible choices. If you are watching this, I want you to understand that this is not a story about crime and punishment, and this is a story about love and sacrifice, and about a father who would do anything to save his child, and about a system that values money more than human life. Henry Collins is not a hero, and he is not a villain, and he is just a man who loved his daughter more than he feared prison, and who chose her life over his own freedom, and whether that makes him right or wrong, I will leave for you to decide. Thank you for listening to this story, and if it moved you, I encourage you to share it and to think about how we can fix a healthcare system that forces families into these impossible situations. And if you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe, because there are many more that need to be told.